23 black queer music icons whose HIV/AIDS stories were buried by silence and stigma. What if some of the most powerful black queer voices in music and nightlife did not just die young, but were pushed into silence long before history had a chance to honor them? Behind the performances were fear, secrecy, stigma, illness, and a world that often looked away when they needed compassion most. Some were stars, some were underground legends. All of them mattered. Stay with me, because these are not just stories about HIV/AIDS. They are stories about talent erasure, survival, and the brutal cost of being unforgettable in a world determined to forget. Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha P. Johnson did not need a chart hit to change history. She changed it with her body, her voice, her visibility, and her refusal to disappear. Born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, Marsha became one of the most recognizable figures in black queer and trans resistance long before mainstream America had language for any of it. She was not polished for respectability. She was loud, floral, radiant, poor, vulnerable, and impossible to reduce. That is exactly why she mattered. She stood at the front edge of a world that wanted people like her erased, and she kept showing up anyway. Her life carried more than protest. It carried survival under constant pressure. Homelessness, violence, police harassment, institutional neglect, and the emotional cost of protecting other people all ran through her years in New York. She gave shelter, raised money, shared food, and treated younger queer people like family even when she had almost nothing herself. She was not just a symbol of rebellion. She was daily care in a brutal city. Do you think Marsha changed the world more through protest or through the way she kept loving people who were already being abandoned? In the final stretch of her life, people close to her believed her health was deteriorating badly. Weight loss, exhaustion, untreated pain, and fear of medical systems shaped those last years. She did not move through the world like someone protected. She moved through it like someone already tired of being refused help. When her body was found in the Hudson River in 1992, the official explanation did not settle the people who loved her. It made the wound larger. Her death landed like one more act of disregard against a life already forced to fight for every inch of recognition. Marsha P. Johnson remains unforgettable because she stood where history was being made and where suffering was being ignored at the same time. She was not a footnote to liberation. She was one of its beating hearts. Sir Lady Java. Sir Lady Java walked onto stages in the 1960s carrying glamour, danger, and legal rebellion in the same body. Born in New Orleans and later becoming a star in Los Angeles nightlife, she was more than a performer. She was a black trans woman insisting on visibility in an era that treated that visibility as a threat. The gowns, the voice, the poise, the comedy, the confidence, none of it was accidental. She built herself to be seen in a world that wanted people like her hidden, arrested, or mocked into silence. What made Java historic was not only performance, it was confrontation. When Los Angeles authorities enforced rules designed to push female impersonators and trans performers off public stages, she fought back. Her legal challenge in the late 1960s made her one of the earliest black trans women in entertainment to force the state to answer for discrimination. That mattered far beyond nightlife. She showed younger performers that stage presence could become political power. Do you think Sir Lady Java's greatest act was entertaining the crowd, or refusing to let the law decide whether she had the right to exist in public? The last years of her life carried a different kind of struggle. Illness, fatigue, recurring pneumonia, and visible decline slowly replaced the old stage invincibility. Her diagnosis came late, and she did not turn it into public confession. She kept that part of herself guarded. That choice fit the era she came from. She had already spent decades fighting to stay visible as a black trans woman. She did not owe the world one more spectacle of pain. When she died, what remained was not pity. What remained was scale. Sir Lady Java had already shifted what was possible before many people around her even knew the language of trans rights. She did not just perform through history, she bent it. Mickey Blanco. Mickey Blanco entered music like a threat to every rule hip-hop had tried to protect. Black, queer, gender non-conforming, poetic, sharp, theatrical, and impossible to flatten. Mickey did not ask rap culture for permission to exist. They arrived with lipstick dresses, raw language, and a willingness to put identity at the center instead of the edge. That alone made them disruptive. Then, the HIV disclosure in 2015 changed the stakes again. It was not an abstract political issue anymore. It became flesh fear, career risk, and survival inside an industry that still treated HIV like contamination instead of reality. Mickey did not hide behind vague wording. They said it directly. They had been living with HIV since 2011. That sentence broke open a silence that many people in music still preferred to keep intact. Shows disappeared. Collaborations thinned. Some people who claimed to support queer art suddenly got quiet. That reaction exposed exactly what Stigma still looked like when it met a real person instead of a slogan. Do you think Mickey Blanco's boldest act was making the music or refusing to let HIV push them into silence after the music was already working? What makes Mickey so important here is that they did not become a tragedy. They stayed alive, kept making work, kept speaking, and kept turning vulnerability into form. That matters because so many HIV stories get told only through death. Mickey forced another version into view, living with the virus, losing work because of it, feeling the emotional damage of rejection, then continuing anyway. Their art did not get softer after disclosure. It got clearer. They remain one of the most visible reminders that survival itself can be radical when the culture around you would rather turn away. Meshell Ndegeocello. Meshell Ndegeocello has always sounded like someone too deep for categories to hold. Bassist, singer, writer, shapeshifter, spiritual excavator. She built a body of work that moved through neo-soul, jazz, funk, R&B, and poetry without asking permission to stay in one lane. Born in Berlin to a military family and raised in the United States, Meshell made music that never felt cheap, decorative, or easy. Desire, gender, grief, faith, blackness, and emotional danger all moved through her catalog. She did not sound interested in performance without consequence. Her place in this story is not built on a public statement that she herself was HIV positive. That distinction matters. What ties her here is the way she has carried the epidemic through memory, intimacy, and art. Lovers, friends, silence, grief, and the stigma attached to people living with HIV all moved into her writing. She did not turn that material into sentimental tribute. She turned it into atmosphere ache, and the kind of song that leaves a bruise after it ends. Do you think Meshell's power comes from what she reveals directly, or from the pain she threads through music without ever reducing it to explanation? That is what makes her role in this subject so different from the others. She stands less as a figure of disclosure and more as a vessel for loss. Her songs do not lecture. They haunt. They keep people who were shamed, hidden, or buried by silence moving inside the music even when their names are not spoken. Meshell Ndegeocello remains essential because she proves that HIV's impact on Black queer life did not stay in hospitals, obituaries, or activism alone. It entered melody, intimacy, fear, longing, and the texture of sound itself. She did not write from distance. She wrote from wound-adjacent truth. Toshi Reagan. Toshi Reagan inherited more than music. She inherited movement, memory, and a family line built on singing against injustice. The daughter of Bernice Johnson Reagan, Toshi grew into an artist whose work never sat still inside one genre. Folk, gospel, blues, soul, rock, political chant, she made them touch each other until the boundaries stopped mattering. Her voice carried grit and conviction, but it also carried privacy. That privacy is central to her place in this story. She never built herself as an open diary for the public. She let the songs take the harder weight. Her connection here is not loud confession. It is the deepening of song under pressure. Illness, fear, changing health, and the burden of knowing how headlines can distort a life all pushed her inward, not into silence, but into another kind of expression. She kept working. She kept singing. The emotional weather inside the music darkened, thickened, and took on more mortality. That shift matters because it shows what survival can sound like when a person refuses spectacle. Do you think Toshi Reagan's strength lies in what she kept private, or in the way she still let the music carry what the headlines never could? She did not disappear into diagnosis. She did not turn herself into a symbol to satisfy public appetite. That restraint gave her art unusual dignity. Toshi's work carries the feeling of someone who understands struggle too well to flatten it for easy consumption. Her songs hold tenderness without sentimentality, resistance without slogan, and vulnerability without surrender. That is why she matters in a story like this. She shows that Black queer endurance does not always arrive through a public declaration. Sometimes it arrives through a guitar, a voice, a body that keeps returning to the stage, and a life that refuses to let sickness have the last word. Chloe Zubilo. Chloe Zubilo did not enter a room quietly, and she never built art for people who wanted comfort. Music performance confrontation, survival, gender refusal, and underground fury all lived in her at once. In New York's punk and queer scenes, she was not just another name passing through the margins. She was one of the people who made the margins feel alive, dangerous, and politically awake. She used stage presence like a weapon. She used identity like a challenge. She made it hard for people to keep pretending they did not see the bodies and lives they were already stepping over. Her connection to HIV was not abstract, and neither was her connection to neglect. Collapse, misreading, delayed care, and the medical system's indifference to Black, queer, and trans suffering all shaped the years that followed. What makes Chloe unforgettable is that she did not become obedient in the face of that damage. She kept performing, she kept writing, she kept making art that confronted gender, illness, and social abandonment as if silence itself were the enemy. Do you think Chloe Zubilo's greatest force came from the music? Or from the way she turned her own life into a direct argument against erasure? That is where her power still lives. She did not clean herself up to be easier to mourn. She remained sharp, difficult, radical, and fully herself. There was no neat mainstream redemption arc waiting for her. There was only endurance expression and the insistence that even a body under siege could still create truth. Chloe Zubilo remains unforgettable because she made refusal into style and survival into art. She did not ask the world to make sense of her. She dared it to try. Blackberry. Blackberry did not build fame through charts, radio, or the machinery of celebrity. He built meaning through presence. In San Francisco's queer Black circles, he became the kind of artist people turned to when grief was too heavy for language. His voice was soft, warm, and steady, and that steadiness mattered in an era when HIV/AIDS was turning ordinary life into a field of funerals. He sang in community centers, shelters, hospital wards, and intimate rooms where people were not looking for spectacle. They were looking for relief. Blackberry gave them that. He made music sound like shelter. That is what made his diagnosis so painful. The virus did not enter the life of someone chasing glamour. It entered the life of someone already giving emotional care to people who were falling apart around him. Bleeding gums, mouth sores, the quiet fear behind symptoms that so many in his community had already learned to recognize. These details changed the meaning of his later years. But he did not retreat into silence. He kept singing. He kept sitting with the dying. He kept making memorial songs and healing spaces while his own body was beginning to fail. Do you think Blackberry's deepest gift was the music itself? Or the comfort he gave people while carrying fear of the same fate? That is why he stays so powerful. He never needed mass fame to become essential. He became essential because he used voice as care. He was not trying to dominate a room. He was trying to hold it together. In that kind of story, the tragedy is not just that he died. It is that someone so gentle had to spend so much of his life singing against abandonment. Blackberry remains unforgettable because he proved that art does not need volume to save lives. Sometimes the most radical voice is the one that stays soft while everything around it is collapsing. Lady Kateria. Lady Kateria turned New York nightlife into a kingdom and then used that kingdom to tell the truth. She was not merely glamorous. She was towering, radiant, theatrical, and impossible to miss. In queer club spaces, she represented what many younger trans women and drag performers were still trying to imagine for themselves: visibility without apology. Heels, sequins, command, humor, danger, beauty. She wore all of it like armor and celebration at once. People did not just watch her perform. They watched her take up space that society had tried to deny her. That made her public disclosure so powerful. HIV had already moved through queer and trans communities with terror, secrecy, and devastating loss. Many people died without saying the word out loud. Kateria chose another path. When she spoke openly on stage, she did not present herself as broken. She presented herself as responsible to those coming after her. She understood that silence was not just personal, it was generational. If she said nothing, younger sisters might step into the same darkness with no warning. Do you think Lady Kateria's bravest act was surviving with glamour, or stepping into the light and naming what others still feared to say? That is why her story carries such force. She kept performing while her health declined. She kept mentoring. She kept making sure truth stayed louder than shame. By the time she died, she had already become larger than a single club, a single stage, or even a single city. The procession that followed her death was not just mourning, it was acknowledgement. Lady Kateria had already done what too few people managed in that era. She made being seen feel like protection instead of exposure. She did not simply wear a crown, she taught others how to survive long enough to imagine one. Prudence Nobantu Mabel. Prudence Nobantu. Mabele broke silence in a country built on denial. Long before visibility became a fashionable word, she stood up in South Africa and said what countless others had been told never to say: she was HIV positive. That sentence did not land in a safe environment. It landed in a place thick with fear, misinformation, shame, patriarchy, and medical stigma. She was not just admitting a diagnosis. She was stepping into public life as a black woman, carrying a truth that many people still associated with moral punishment rather than human reality. What made Prudence extraordinary was that she did not stop at confession. She organized, she founded, she traveled. She spoke to women who had been assaulted, abandoned, blamed, and medically dismissed. She understood that HIV in women's lives was rarely just about a virus. It was also about power violence, silence, and the refusal of systems to protect those already most vulnerable. Her work with the Positive Women's Network gave shape to that understanding. She became one of the clearest public voices saying that survival without dignity was not enough. Do you think Prudence's greatest courage was saying, "I am HIV positive," or refusing to let those words remain only about herself? That is why her story matters so deeply. She did not let the diagnosis shrink her into a cautionary tale. She turned it into public language, public pressure, and public movement. Singing, speaking, marching, confronting, insisting, she made HIV visible in women's lives where too many institutions preferred invisibility. When she died, what remained was not just memory of illness. What remained was structure. She had built something. Prudence Nobantu Mabel remains unforgettable because she showed that breaking silence is not a single moment. It is a lifetime of forcing the world to hear what it tried to bury. Vicky Lane. Vicky Lane sang like someone who understood that a voice could be more than performance. It could be access, warning, comfort, and survival. Trained in opera yet rooted in community struggle, she moved through stages and advocacy spaces with the same sense of mission. She did not use music as decoration for activism. She fused the two. Her work centered people the system preferred not to see: clearly undocumented individuals, trans youth, poor communities, Black and brown people living with HIV and trying to stay alive in a healthcare culture that often met them with delay or indifference. Her diagnosis sharpened that mission instead of ending it. When the symptoms got harder to ignore and the hospital finally confirmed HIV, Vicky did not fold into private grief. She turned the diagnosis outward. Insurance treatment gaps, class, race, and access became inseparable from her story. She kept singing while speaking more directly about the brutal difference between being sick and being able to afford survival. That is where her activism hit hardest. She was not talking in theory. She was talking from inside the machinery. Do you think Vicky Lane's strongest legacy lies in the songs? Or in the way she turned her own diagnosis into a public demand for care? That question is what gives her story so much weight. She raised money. She built programs. She kept performing even as her health deteriorated. The image of her is not one of retreat. It is one of persistence under pressure. Her final years did not erase her voice. They clarified its purpose. Vicky Lane remains unforgettable because she treated music as a form of service. She was not singing over suffering. She was singing through it and trying to make sure the people most likely to be abandoned had at least one voice refusing to leave them there. Tori Cooper. Tori Cooper turned a diagnosis into policy, and that is a different kind of power. She was not built by celebrity machinery. She was built by pain refusal organizing and a decision made in private that her life would not collapse into the meaning other people assigned to HIV. When the test came back positive, what hit her hardest was not just the virus. It was the coldness. No warmth, no eye contact. No human care in the moment human care was needed most. That kind of encounter changes people. In Tori's case, it pushed her toward a life of making sure others would not receive the same brutal emptiness. She moved from support groups to leadership, from personal recovery to structural intervention. Churches, clinics, panels, national policy spaces, she kept showing up. She made HIV advocacy specific to Black trans lives at a time when too much public health language still treated those lives as afterthoughts. Her phrase, "We don't spread HIV, we spread survival," cuts because it reverses the accusation. It takes a group so often stigmatized as danger and names them instead as carriers of wisdom, adaptation, and care. Do you think Tori Cooper's greatest achievement is the policy influence or the fact that she gave language and dignity to people who had been spoken about but rarely spoken with? That is why she matters so much. Being appointed to the President's Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS was historic, but the deeper force of her work lives lower to the ground. It lives in rooms where scared people sit down and realize they are not alone. It lives in the confidence she gives others to ask for care without shame. Tori Cooper remains unforgettable because she did not simply survive HIV. She helped change who gets counted as fully human inside the fight against it. Kia LaBeija. Kia LaBeija never had the illusion of a life before HIV. The virus was already there, already structuring the rhythms of medicine secrecy and survival from childhood onward. That changes a person's relationship to identity completely. She did not discover HIV in adulthood as a separate event from selfhood. She grew inside it. Hospital visits, pills, side eyes, questions without answers, and the exhausting loneliness of carrying something the world misreads all became part of how she learned to exist. Most people would be crushed by that kind of inheritance. Kia turned it into art. Her photography gave form to what language often fails to hold. Shadows, dim light, vulnerability, memory, and bodily honesty all appeared in the work, not as decoration, but as testimony. Then ballroom gave her another medium. Movement, facewalk, house lineage, and performance offered a second kind of truth, one rooted in visibility, community, and refusal. She did not split the artist from the HIV-positive child. She fused them. That fusion is what makes her story so powerful. Do you think Kia LaBeija's deepest strength lies in surviving HIV or in making survival visible enough for other people to recognize themselves in it? That question matters because too many stories about HIV-positive youth are told only through pity or prevention. Kia rejects both limits. She lives, creates, performs, exhibits, and speaks without reducing herself to a warning. The virus is part of her story, but it is not the only author of it. Kia LaBeija remains unforgettable because she transformed inheritance into authorship. She took something the world still approaches with fear and built images strong enough to make that fear look small. Jade Electra. Jade Electra understood early that visibility could save lives if it refused shame. Singer, DJ, drag performer, host, community builder. She moved through nightlife not as decoration, but as signal. Sequins, humor, groove, and soul made people listen, but what kept them close was the honesty underneath it. When HIV entered her life, she did not disappear into private despair. She wanted confirmation so she could fight. That instinct says everything about her. She did not approach diagnosis as an ending. She approached it as a call to organize. That is what shaped the rest of her work. Support networks, safe spaces, education, performance, and public conversation all fused together. She could move from a club to a hospital room without changing the core of who she was. The beat stayed. The mission stayed. Her shows did not treat HIV as a tragic sidebar. They made it visible inside joy nightlife storytelling and black queer endurance. That combination matters because too many people still imagine HIV-positive life only through decline. Jade kept insisting on motion. Do you think Jade Electra's real brilliance is her performance style or the way she made people feel seen without stripping away the hard truth? That is why she lasts in memory. Hospital visits, fatigue, and illness did not erase the sparkle. They gave it context. She kept dancing, hosting, and speaking as if celebration itself could become a weapon against stigma. In her hands, nightlife was not escape from reality. It was a place where reality could be named out loud and still survive the night. Jade Electra remains unforgettable because she refused the false choice between honesty and glamour. She kept both. And in doing that, she gave people with HIV something precious, an image of themselves that still glowed. Lee Davids. Lee Davids did not need a major stage to become unforgettable. She carried urgency into classrooms, markets, clinics, township gatherings, and any place where silence around HIV and queer life had become deadly. In South Africa, especially, in spaces where trans people were already treated as disposable, that kind of work was not just activism. It was intervention. She danced, educated, spoke, joked, and persisted in environments where compassion was often underfunded and dignity had to be fought for in public. Her diagnosis came through a system already known for coldness. That detail matters. She was not welcomed into care. She was processed by it. The cruelty of being told you are infected without comfort or guidance stays in a person, and Lee carried that cruelty forward as fuel rather than surrender. Even as the body weakened, even as oxygen became necessary, she refused to disappear neatly. That refusal gave her legend. Not fame, legend. Do you think Lee Davids changed more lives through the information she shared, or through the fact that people saw her still standing while the system was failing her? That is what makes her story so hard to forget. She did not separate performance from message. She used movement as a carrier for truth. She used humor as insulation against despair. She used her own visible survival to challenge the lie that trans people living with HIV should retreat from public life. When her body finally gave in, what remained was not just grief. What remained was example. Lee Davids stays powerful because she turned every appearance into proof that even in a world slow to care, someone could still choose to keep showing up in the lights. Gracie Cartier. Gracie Cartier moved through fashion and performance with the kind of beauty that makes people assume the rest of life must have been easier. It was not. Elegance wrapped her image, but endurance held it up. As a black trans model and performer, she entered spaces where appearance was celebrated only so long as complexity stayed out of frame. HIV made that separation impossible. Once diagnosis entered her life, she had to decide whether beauty would remain surface or become testimony. She chose testimony. That choice changed the texture of her work. Photo campaigns, writing, public speaking, and stage appearances no longer sat only inside glamour. They carried information about trans healthcare access, fear, and what happens when people of color living with HIV are treated as visually valuable but medically disposable. She did not step away from beauty. She forced beauty to stand beside truth. That is harder, and it lasts longer. Do you think Gracie Cartier's most powerful statement was how she looked, or how she insisted that truth belonged in the same frame as beauty? Even as her health deteriorated, she kept performing and speaking. Oxygen could enter the picture, illness could enter the body, but she refused to let shame enter the narrative. That refusal gives her story its strength. She did not live like a warning. She lived like someone determined to remain whole, even while the body was under assault. Gracie Cartier remains unforgettable because she made elegance carry weight. She showed that grace is not softness alone. Sometimes it is the decision to stay visible while the world would rather file your suffering somewhere off camera. Egypt. Egypt. LaBeija carried house lineage and memory in a way very few people ever do. In ballroom, a name is never only a name. It is inheritance, discipline, shelter style, and survival all at once. Egypt understood that. She was not simply walking for herself. She was carrying a family line, a cultural history, and a set of younger lives watching how she moved. That is why her presence hit so hard. She was beauty with function. She was elegance with instruction. Her HIV diagnosis did not pull her out of that role. It made the role heavier. She responded by thinking immediately about the children around her, about what they needed to learn to protect themselves, and about how many Black trans women had already died unnamed. That instinct reveals the core of who she was. Not self-pity, not retreat, stewardship. Even as health declined, she kept teaching, performing, and speaking in spaces where shame still controlled too much of the conversation. Do you think Egypt LaBeija's greatest legacy is the glamour she embodied, or the way she turned that glamour into protection for the next generation? That is why her death echoed so loudly in ballroom, even without mainstream recognition. The community understood what had been lost. Not just a performer, a keeper, a mothering force. A visible reminder that confidence can be passed hand to hand like survival itself. Egypt LaBeija remains unforgettable because she did not just walk a category. She walked a whole tradition forward while her body was under siege. That kind of courage does not fade when the music ends. Chili Pepper. Chili Pepper treated performance like a promise. When she said she performed so no one else would feel alone, that was not branding. That was a mission statement. In Chicago's queer nightlife, she became a figure people remembered not only because of the gowns, lips, wigs, and command, but because she radiated care through persona. She knew how many queer people came into those rooms carrying fear secrecy diagnosis or shame, and she understood the stage could interrupt that loneliness for a few hours. She made herself unforgettable on purpose because being remembered was part of what she feared losing most. Her openness about living with HIV gave that fear another shape. She did not frame it as a confession meant to earn sympathy. She framed it as fact and then kept performing. Fever fatigue, weight loss, bodily decline. None of those things stopped her from treating each night like a stand against erasure. That is where the emotion in her story lands. She was not trying to outrun mortality. She was trying to make sure mortality did not erase presence before it arrived. Do you think Chili Pepper's deepest strength was her honesty about HIV, or the way she kept turning nightlife into a place where other people could feel less afraid? That is why the image of the untouched wig hit so hard after her death. It suggests interruption, yes, but it also suggests continuation. The show did not finish, but the intention behind it did not disappear. Chili Pepper remains unforgettable because she understood what too many people living with stigma understand: being seen is not vanity. Sometimes it is proof that you were here at all. She gave that proof night after night. Octavia Y. Lewis. Octavia Y. Lewis speaks from a place many people never survive long enough to articulate. HIV entered her life, but it did not reduce her to patienthood. She answered diagnosis with work. That response says a great deal about her character. Some people fight by retreating into private management. Octavia fought by becoming public, direct, and spiritually available to others. She built trust in spaces where Black trans people had often been taught not to trust doctors, institutions, churches, or even support services that claimed to care. That trust did not come from polished messaging. It came from lived cost. Hospitalizations, setbacks, physical vulnerability, and repeated reminders that healthcare systems were never built with Black trans women at the center. All of that sits behind her public calm. When she tells people not to be ashamed, the words land differently because they come from someone who has already carried the weight of that shame and outlived it. She does not offer fantasy. She offers usable truth. Do you think Octavia Y. Lewis's greatest gift is the information she shares or the spiritual steadiness she gives to people who thought they had already been written off? That is what makes her unforgettable. She does not speak like someone chasing applause. She speaks like someone building a bridge while others are still falling. Her work is communal at the deepest level. She is not just advocating for resources. She is helping people reclaim their right to stand in the world without being reduced to diagnosis, stigma, or fear. Octavia Y. Lewis remains powerful because she turned survival into ministry without ever needing to call it that. Diz made a different choice from many artists before him. He said it while still in motion. He did not wait until a retrospective, an obituary, or someone else's version of events. He disclosed publicly that he was HIV positive and refused the script that says, queer Black men must carry that truth quietly if they want to keep their careers intact. That decision matters because disclosure in real time is not abstract courage. It has consequences. It changes bookings, collaborators' audience perception, and the emotional temperature of every room you enter afterward. What makes Diz compelling is that he kept singing through that shift. Symptoms, fear, silence, testing, the shock of diagnosis, all of that entered the music and changed its weight. Love songs started carrying survival inside them. Heartbreak songs started sounding like internal battle. The stage did not stop being a performance space, but it also became a recovery space, a naming space, and a place where other people could hear a version of themselves without shame. Do you think Diz's bravest moment was the disclosure itself, or the choice to keep returning to the stage after disclosure changed everything? That is why he matters now. He offers a living alternative to the older story in which HIV-positive Black queer people appear only as warning or memorial. He is neither. He is a working artist making truth part of the performance rather than something hidden behind it. Diz remains unforgettable because he did not allow diagnosis to cut him off from voice. He made voice carry the diagnosis and still move. Tiona Nekia McLauden. Tiona Nekia. McLauden enters this story from a different angle, not as a person living with HIV, but as someone refusing the second death that happens when people are forgotten. That role is not secondary. It is essential. Too many Black, queer, and trans lives touched by HIV/AIDS were not just lost medically. They were abandoned culturally. Tiona built work around that abandonment. Film installation, memory artifact, atmosphere. She uses art to interrupt forgetting. She does not treat the dead as symbols to be consumed. She approaches them as lives interrupted by neglect and then threatened again by erasure. That is why her work carries so much force. She understands that memorial can be political. To remember someone properly is to challenge the system that made forgetting them so easy in the first place. Her installations do not shout in the obvious way. They create absence, flicker, intimacy, and emotional pressure. The viewer is forced to sit with what is missing and ask why the missing was allowed to happen. Do you think Tiona's strongest act is making art about loss, or making sure loss never gets mistaken for disappearance. That is what makes her indispensable to a story like this. Without people like Tiona, too many of these names would remain buried under stigma-fragmented archives and selective public memory. She does not claim to replace the dead. She helps make room for them to be heard again. Tiona Nekia McLaughlin remains unforgettable because she proves remembrance is not passive. It is labor. It is witness. It is one more way of refusing to let silence win. They had talent. They had presence. They had voices powerful enough to move rooms, shift culture, and speak for people living in silence. But many of them were denied what other artists receive so easily: protection, compassion, and remembrance. The question is not only who they were. The question is why the world made it so easy to let them disappear. If they had been safer, straighter, richer, or more acceptable to the mainstream, would history have honored them differently? Tell me what you think in the comments, and follow and subscribe to CineLegacy Vault Hollywood for more stories the world should never have buried.